Hi, it's Peter Schweizer, and welcome to the Drill Down. Well, the FBI has been in the crosshairs in Washington, D.C. because of scandal after scandal after scandal. But what about one of the biggest domestic terrorist attacks in American history? We're going to unpack that with a very special guest and talk about the common threads that ride through all these instances of FBI corruption. And I'm going to have that conversation with our guest, with the co-host, Eric Eggers. Eric, how are you?
I'm excellent. I am irrationally excited for this episode of the Drill Down, Peter Schweizer.
Good.
Because while I always brag about you and the work that we do here at the Government Accountability Institute, our work has been used to help presidents get elected, but also help get them impeached.
Yeah.
We're actually going to talk to someone today whose works are even more consequential than that. Margaret Roberts. Her work has actually helped people get out of prison.
Yep.
And then as a producer for America's Most Wanted, put them in prison. So top that, Schweitzer.
Yeah, no, I got nothing for that. But
right.
We are joined by Margaret Roberts today. She has a terrific new book out called Blowback, The Untold Story of the FBI and the Oklahoma City Bombing. Margaret is an award-winning investigative journalist. She worked at America's Most Wanted. She's done a lot of incredible work. She's interviewed some of the principals involved in Oklahoma City. We want to talk about that case and talk about how it's related to all the other more recent examples of FBI incompetence, corruption, whatever you want to call it. Margaret, thanks again for joining us. We appreciate all the work you're doing.
Good morning, Peter and Eric. Great to be with you.
So let's talk about something that you said that's pretty startling. It's basically the thesis of this book. And I'm just going to quote you. You said at Oklahoma City, the bombing, the biggest domestic terrorism attack in American history, was not an act of a lone wolf terror. It was manufactured terror made in Washington, D.C. by the FBI, a sting operation that went sideways. That is remarkable. Tell us briefly what happened in Oklahoma City and back that up in terms of the evidence.
Sure. Well, just to recap, some of your audience won't have been there, won't have witnessed it. Most of us know Oklahoma City and the bombing because to this day it stands as America's deadliest domestic terror attack. 168 men, women, and children slaughtered, and hundreds more injured in that devastating bombing on April 19, 1995. It was almost immediately focused on one man, Timothy McVeigh, and became a case of lone wolf terror. That's what prosecutors told a jury, that's what newspapers told the public, and that's what history books finally left us with, recorded. The bombing was the work of a disgruntled soldier from the Iraq War, angry at his government, case closed. But also, from the very beginning, there were cracks in this case. I came to it with a perspective a bit unique because not only was I witnessing with millions of other Americans this horrific spectacle of this terror attack, but I had been the news director of America's Most Wanted and worked hand in glove with the FBI for 3 years on the highest profile manhunt stories. And this story, before it took a big U-turn, was a manhunt story because 24 eyewitnesses on the ground in Oklahoma City on April 19 saw not just Timothy McVeigh in the Ryder truck, but the never identified accomplice who rode next to him and was known only as John Doe 2, who exited the truck with Timothy McVeigh and vanished into thin air. So that was the first big clue that this was not a case of lone wolf terror because Timothy McVeigh had an accomplice in the bomb truck.
But then you say not just that it was not an act of lone wolf terror, and you do a great job in the book of laying out the evidence to suggest like how how adjacent and or even involved the FBI was. Timothy McVeigh would tell associates that he had been working with the FBI. You mentioned that there was a member of the grand jury who said this whole prosecution is, flawed, and they're kind of trying to railroad this whole thing. So lots of problems there. But for you to say that it was that the Oklahoma City bombing, which, as you noted, killed 168 people, 19 of whom were under the age of 6, was manufactured terror made in Washington, D.C. by the FBI. What's your evidence for that? Because that is, quite honestly, a shocking claim.
It is a shocking claim, and it took almost 20 years to get to that revelation. The picture comes into view gradually as the investigation. My course follows the path of an attorney named Jesse Trinidu, who has pressed landmark Freedom of Information Act litigation to force pieces of this picture into the public view. So the first stage of the investigation is a lot of document research and does begin to focus on this Aryan Republican Army terror gang that hid out in a right-wing enclave in eastern Oklahoma known as Elohim City. The closer in the investigation comes in 2011, after much has been discovered about the Aryan Republican Army, after a series of surprising revelations. A top FBI spy and a whistleblower comes out of the shadows, and also a fellow Marine of the activist lawyer at the middle of the story. His name is Jesse Trinidu. Both these men are Marines, and the FBI whistleblower, whose name is John Matthews, comes out of the shadows and says, I've been following your crusade to get to the bottom of what really happened in Oklahoma City, and I want to tell you my story. And his story was as a top FBI undercover operative in an infiltration program in the 1990s called PATCON, short for Patriot Conspiracy. He infiltrated 22 groups and eventually exited the program disillusioned because, as he said, it was set up to incite violence, and I signed on to stop the violence. So it was his information and insight into PATCON, which he said he believed, he said he didn't work the PATCON operation in Oklahoma City, but he said he believed that the bombing was a PATCON operation, not intended that the bomb would go off. It was intended to catch the terrorists. But his bombshell revelation, which he said he knew directly, was that the FBI had set up the Aryan Republican Army terror group as a front group to incite violence.
We are talking with Margaret Roberts. She's got a terrific new book out called Blowback, The Untold Story of the FBI and the Oklahoma City Bombing. What I find so compelling about the research that you have brought forward is that this is not really just a story about Oklahoma City, because the thing that you talk about, the notion that the FBI is going to infiltrate groups that they perceive to be a threat, and I think we would all agree that's not a bad idea in theory, right? You want to know what your enemies are doing, but there seems to be these instances where they overstep a bounds or they create things that aren't necessarily there. I think of the Michigan kidnapping plot that involved Governor Whitner, where, again, the FBI seemed to be involved there, and there are questions about did they essentially entrap these guys, encourage these guys to do something that they weren't originally planning. And then, of course, January 6th, there have been questions raised about January 6th. Was it somehow radicalized potentially by FBI informers? I think, look, there were people that hit cops and engage in activity. They, should suffer the consequences. But was it organized, and was it an accelerant added by the FBI? Talk about this FBI strategy of infiltration as it relates to Oklahoma City, but how it seems to be a repeated problem that these things get out of control. And rather than preventing crimes from occurring, maybe they are actually accelerating them, at least in some cases.
Well, Peter, I think you put your finger on really the nerve center of this investigation. Excuse me. And I will just point to how it works in the Oklahoma City case. Bear in mind, this is a 20-year epic, so facts and people and clues and evidence come out slowly. But one stunner was my interview in Supermax prison in Colorado with Timothy McVeigh's convicted co-conspirator, Terry Nichols. And I'm the only journalist who has interviewed Nichols face-to-face. He told me his agenda was that really revenge. Another person involved, let's say, in the bombing conspiracy was a man named Roger Moore. And Roger Moore in the bombing trials was always portrayed as a victim of McVeigh and Nichols' robbery, thought to be part of how they financed the bombing. Terry Nichols has insisted to me face to face that Roger Moore was a government provocateur, that Roger Moore was not a victim. He was Timothy McVeigh's partner, one of his partners in all of this. And most stunningly, Nichols insists that Roger Moore provided explosives that were used in the bomb. Roger Moore as an undercover federal operative. And he was not the only one. We don't have confirmation of all of these operatives. But your point about the Michigan case, the Governor Whitmer case, is so well taken, because as we investigated one after another of these, there just seemed to be, a lot of undercover operatives in this case. Nichols, his most bombshell claim in Supermax was that Timothy McVeigh himself was operating as an undercover government asset, and that McVeigh had let this slip in a moment of stress and anxiety shortly before the bombing. Only once did he make this claim, but of course this came from Nichols. It is echoed by another prisoner that I interviewed on death row, who wrote a book about McVeigh, and McVeigh told this prisoner named David Paul Hammer the same story. Of course, one would want to corroborate what two prisoners said. It is very interesting that McVeigh, and a very little known fact, McVeigh told the same story to his first public defenders before they quickly exited the case, since they had so many friends who had, been involved or injured in the bombing. But McVeigh told his first lawyers, so fresh after being arrested, that he had been operating as a government, in a government undercover program. And likewise, in documents that were submitted in court, he wrote a letter to his sister telling her the same or similar story, that he had been plucked out of basic training or his tryout for special forces and enrolled in an undercover program. So it's certainly something to think about. The big picture is the cast of informants or suspected informants that we found in the course of 20 years, and it's a remarkable rogues gallery.
Well, and just think about what you just said. I mean, if I can, just because you're so engaged in all the detail and every revelation that's come from the 20-year investigation. But I mean, our listeners just heard you say that the man who was convicted and ultimately executed by the government for committing this act of terrorism had told people he was a government asset, and that some of the materials for the bomb were provided not just by a government asset, but by a government agent, which I think is, stunning. But I do think, to Peter's point, it fits the pattern as we've seen in Michigan. It's not just, I've heard you say we have a surveillance crisis in this country. To me, the word surveillance is too passive for what we've seen happen in these cases, because it's not just monitoring. It's not like a mall cop who observe and report. It's participate and elevate. And I think that in this case, it seems like they elevated it to the point where they provided the materials, the person who was behind the scheme. I guess, how do you, now that you have done this and you have discovered this, how has it changed the way you have viewed other things, and the stories we've been told about these high-profile cases, like the Michigan kidnapping plot, like the Epstein file investigation? I've heard you bring up, I'd never heard this before, the Boston Marathon bombing. I mean, it seems like you are now prepared to question almost every official narrative, because you think there's quite a significant possibility that there's much more to the story. It's not just we caught the bad guys. We might have been working with the bad guys.
I do think there's much more to the story. And I think the reason my book is so relevant right now, it's not just a history. It really is an origin story for how we got to where we are today. This summer, everybody wants to know, everybody wants transparency, and we know we don't have it. Everybody wants accountability, and we know we don't have it. And it just so happens, it wasn't what myself and my circle, we were just trying. I started out with a simple question: what really happened here? But it spiraled. And as it did, it reveals something I think is important, which is the cost of the concealment. The government has spent 30 years concealing the story of what really happened in Oklahoma City. And if it hadn't been practicing that concealment, for instance, almost no one knows, the FBI collected surveillance videotape of the delivery of that bomb, of the two men getting out of the truck. If we had been, but the FBI never allowed the American public to see those images, which would answer so many questions. And obviously there's liability, or we would be seeing those videotapes. So to me, it was unknowable when I started this, some of what I have discovered about the undercover element of this story, and the fact that what is the story, that it's a what really happened moment that I think a lot of people are sharing this summer as we look at the Russiagate story, as we look at the Jeffrey Epstein case with his potential connection to intelligence, the Boston bombing. These are some of them tragedies that might never have happened if we had learned the truth about Oklahoma City when it happened.
Well, and I think this is what I really appreciate about your work, Margaret. You are very judicious, you are very fact-based, and you raise some very, very important questions. And it shows, I think, the necessity of transparency. Right? There are enough suspicions, there are enough instances where it seems like the FBI may have overreached. And again, I think that we all agree one of the FBI's role is if there are bad dudes, if there's a jihadi cell that is operating in the United States, boy, let's get an informant in there. But the problem is if the incentive structure in the FBI is such that you are, in a sense, creating a demand for your services, right? In other words, there's no plot to kidnap the governor, but maybe we should gin one up because it'll make us look better.
Now you're making sense.
That's a problem. That's a problem. And again, as you pointed out, I think very well, in the case of Oklahoma City, Timothy McVeigh made these claims. We have no idea whether they're true. He had all the incentive in the world to manufacture something, but there's some very interesting questions about the other people that were involved in Oklahoma City. So my question for you, Margaret, is on the issue of transparency. What could be done right now by Attorney General Pam Bondi to bring greater transparency to Oklahoma City? And what would you like to see on some of these other cases as it regards transparency? Because it seems to me we have a crisis in the country of distrust of the FBI and some of these law enforcement entities. We should trust them. We need to trust them. But one of the ways they can regain trust is by having greater transparency. So what's some of the things that could be done right now to help with this problem?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that, Peter. There are a couple of very specific things. To return for a minute to the surveillance videotapes, imagine this. That lawsuit, that Freedom of Information lawsuit by Jesse Trinidu, was tried in 2014. However, at the last minute, his star witness, who was John Matthews, the whistleblower, pulled out of the trial, telling Jesse that he had been pressured by the FBI and that he was afraid of losing his medical benefits and his pension. And as he put it in almost a plea, I don't want to be just another homeless vet living under a bridge. That triggered formal witness tampering charges against the FBI by Jesse Trinidu, and the court ordering a special master to investigate those charges. That was 11 years ago. John Matthews' sealed deposition would perhaps lay out the entire anatomy of that infiltration, that rogue infiltration program of the 1990s. But it has sat sealed for all this time. Attorney General Bondi has a letter on her desk since March from Jesse Trinidu asking her to support his request that the DOJ step down and not resist or oppose the opening of that sealed deposition. It could be a bombshell. Another flashpoint here is the surveillance videotapes themselves, of course, and that judgment from the fully litigated trial seeking release videotapes, that's sitting behind the witness tampering, the outcome of the witness tampering charges. So, 11 years is a long time. Both the men, the principals here, Jesse Trinidu seeking what's on those tapes, and John Matthews as his star witness, these men are both in their 70s now. So there's a horrible sense of just waiting out the clock that's in play here. And those are the immediate, I think, action points.
Do you believe that the surveillance video will show an undercover FBI agent with Timothy McVeigh?
I don't know. The possibilities are, remember, it's not just who was in the truck, but who was around the truck, who was in the shot, as well as Timothy McVeigh. There may have been multiple people. And an idea that, Eric, that came up after John Matthews told Jesse so much about PatCon, one thing that he said was that PatCon videotaped everything. So we know that the FBI had Timothy McVeigh under surveillance for months before the Oklahoma City bombing. So it's possible, again, we don't know, but it's possible that PatCon itself was surveilling the bombing. And, they could have been the ones shooting these images that America has never been allowed to see.
So just quickly on that, because I've listened to a lot of other interviews you've done, and John Matthews was the subject of a Newsweek article that came out in 2011, although it was heavily edited and didn't release as much information about his story and this PatCon, this effort to infiltrate these conservative groups. But Peter, I mean, we've talked about how under Obama, we saw the Obama administration, they targeted these right-wing groups. We've seen homeschool parents be considered by the FBI during COVID like threats. Mm-hmm. Listen to this one excerpt from this Newsweek article about this FBI informant and his work as somebody who infiltrates these white supremacist groups. It says, FBI efforts to avert another outrage have taken on increased importance in recent years as fears of Islamic terrorism, a sour economy, expanded federal powers under the Patriot Act, and the nation's first black president have swelled the ranks of extremist groups. They say the number of extremist right-wing groups, white supremacist groups, has gone from 149 to 824, and they cite the Southern Poverty Law Center. My question is did they just use the idea that Obama existed? Like, did they kind of create and inflate the threat of white supremacist groups because of, I mean, that's one benefit of being involved in these groups. Like, we're here, we know who these guys are, so we're going to puff up what we're going to tell you is this big threat because that's our current front.
Well, and I want to get Margaret's take on this too. My thought is two things. Number one, we do know that some of these groups exist, right? We all acknowledge that. But we also know that government agencies, whether it's the Pentagon, whether it's, housing and urban development, whether it's the FBI, you get budgets based on the demand for your services, and you don't get larger budgets by downplaying threats and saying it's not a problem. So this goes to the heart of the question and the matter, which is transparency. I firmly believe it will actually help the FBI if there's greater transparency, because it will sort of separate the wheat from the chaff. And I'm not saying anything out of turn here. The New York Times exposed it, but I have served as a confidential informant for the FBI. It was really just on corruption cases. It was nothing, there were no microphones or anything.
Cloak and dagger?
Right. No cloak and dagger, believe me. But paper cuts were the biggest risk I suffered. But my point is that we all acknowledge there is a place for this. But if it operates under a cloak and you can hide things for 30 years that people have been raising questions about, that's when the suspicion arises, and that's when the concern arises. So your final take on reform, are you optimistic that we're going to see greater transparency, Margaret, on all of these cases, or at least on the Oklahoma City case?
Yes, because I think there are these specific initiatives on Oklahoma, and I think this is a bit of luck, but the timing is America is hungry for transparency this summer. And to one more point, a little bit bigger picture, Peter, I know that you know very well how Washington works, but it seems to me that Congress from what my research is that Congress needs to play a bigger role here. And with the power of the budget, with the oversight of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Congress has been frustrated. They've tried a couple of times. I just would note an extraordinary moment when Representative Dana Rohrabacher was investigating the Aryan Republican Army. I mean, they are the prime suspects here in my investigation. And when he was investigating them, the DOJ hid one of the paroled ARA members from his investigation, and he blasted the DOJ in his final report back in 2006, shortly before my interview with Terry Nichols. But Congress has struggled. Senator Charles Grassley has struggled. He was involved in the questions about the Boston Marathon bombing and whether the older brother was an undercover informant. So I think this is a moment we know. I mean, any of us who's seen these interviews that Kash Patel of the FBI has given and Dan Bongino, I mean, these leaders at the FBI are, for whatever reason, under incredible stress. And Congress, specifically the Senate, in its powers of, oversight, has a role to play. Let's go back to 1975 and the Church Committee and what, a milestone that was. And yet, obviously, the problems with the intelligence community that were identified there have not been rectified.
Well, we've been talking with Margaret Roberts. She's written a terrific book called Blowback, The Untold Story of the FBI and the Oklahoma City Bombing. If you like actual journalism, not hot takes, not commentary, you like facts and investigative research, this is precisely the book for you. So I would encourage everybody to pick it up. Eric, final thoughts. Are you optimistic on this issue of transparency in the FBI?
What I'm optimistic for is that Margaret Roberts is going to sell a lot of books, because I think the timing is actually perfect for this. Yeah. It's like when my book, Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election, had it come out on like November 10th, 2020, A, I probably wouldn't be here. B, it'd be in a much nicer shirt. I feel like this is the time for Margaret Roberts. Like, I think it's perfect time to come out with something that shows, hey, the FBI has been lying to you, and they've been kind of much more involved in some of these things. So I do think that it's going to be a big success, and we thank you for your time, because it was terrific, and it's quite revelatory to me. I will never trust anyone again, including in court, apparently Peter Schweizer, who he just declared as himself a Fed.
Well, we thank you, the audience, for taking the time to listen to the podcast. We know your time is valuable. You can subscribe to this podcast at thedrilldown.com or wherever fine podcasts are located. Thanks again. Until next time.